Miss Marple and Scandal at the Winter Charity Bazaar. Hello, dear listeners, and welcome to Cafe Tales. I'm Ailey as we settle in. Tell me, does winter's coziness make you smile, or do you long for bright summer days? Share your thoughts, and please subscribe for a new mystery every day. Now let's begin. Chapter 1. Snow over St. Mildred's. The train from London arrived at Waverley Edge precisely 17 minutes late, which Miss Jane Marple reflected was rather good going, considering the weather. Through the carriage window, she watched the snow settle on the platform in that peculiar English way, tentative at first, as though testing whether it would be welcome. Miss Marple. Oh, my dear Jane. Mrs. Agatha Price stood beneath the station awning, a plump figure wrapped in sensible tweeds and what appeared to be 3 different scarves. Her round face beamed with genuine pleasure as Miss Marple descended carefully from the train, mindful of the icy steps. "Agatha, how very kind of you to meet me," Miss Marple said, accepting her friend's enthusiastic embrace. "I do hope I haven't put you to too much trouble, especially with the bazaar preparations." "Nonsense. Having you here is the greatest comfort imaginable. Though I confess." Mrs. Price lowered her voice as they walked toward her small motor car. "Things have been rather trying these past few weeks." Miss Marple made a sympathetic murmur. She had known Agatha Price for 40 years, ever since they had served together on a missionary committee, and she recognized the particular note of strain in her friend's voice. It reminded her of the time Mrs. Ledbetter's daughter had become engaged to that most unsuitable young man from the chemist's shop. All brave smiles masking considerable anxiety. The drive through the village took them past cottages with smoke curling from their chimneys and shops with their windows bright against the gathering dusk. Waverley Edge was larger than St. Mary-me, Miss Marple observed, but possessed the same essential character of all English villages: a high street, a duck pond, and undoubtedly more than its fair share of gossip. "The bazaar is tomorrow," Mrs. Price said, navigating a corner with rather more vigor than strictly necessary. "We've been planning it for months. All the usual stalls, of course, jams, knitted goods, white elephant table. But this year we have something quite special. Lady Whitcomb has donated a diamond necklace for the raffle. Quite magnificent. Her mother's apparently worth several hundred, Thevikar says." "How very generous," Miss Marple said carefully. Yes, indeed." Mrs. Price's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Though between you and me, Jane, I rather wish she hadn't. It's caused no end of, well, complications isn't quite the word. Tensions, perhaps." Miss Marple waited with the patience of long practice. A direct question she'd found often closed a door that silence left ajar. "The committee has been most peculiar," Mrs. Price continued after ammoment. "Lydia Trench, she's our treasurer, married to Bernard Trench. Orather was married before he passed last spring. She's been absolutely insistent about the security arrangements. Had Thevikar install a special display case with a lock, and then there's been some fuss about the church accounts. The bishop wants an audit before Easter, perfectly routine, but you'd think we were hiding the crown jewels the way some people have been carrying on." They turned through a gate into a neat gravel drive. Mrs. Price's cottage was exactly as Miss Marple had imagined, trim, well-kept, with a garden that, even under its blanket of snow, showed signs of devoted attention. "You'll want to rest before dinner," Mrs. Price said, leading the way inside. "Though I should mention the vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, has invited us for sherry at 7. She's most eager to meet you. Quite reads all those detective stories, apparently. And when I mentioned you'd help sort out that dreadful business in St. Mary-me, I merely made 1 or 2 small observations," Miss Marple said mildly. "Nothing at all clever." Her room overlooked the back garden, and through the window she could see the church of St. Mildred's, its square tower rising against the darkening sky. The snow was falling more steadily now, soft and silent. Miss Marple unpacked her few things with practiced efficiency, hanging her second-best dress. the gray silk would honestly for the bazaar, and arranging her knitting on the bedside table. The scarf she was making for her great-nephew had reached a critical juncture, involving a rather tricky cable pattern. At 7 precisely, she and Mrs. Price made their way along the village street to the vicarage. The cold was sharp and clean, and their breath made small clouds in the lamplight. The Reverend Thomas Clement proved to be a tall, thin man with the vague air of someone perpetually searching for mislaid spectacles. His wife, by contrast, wasmal, dark, and possessed of an energy that seemed barely contained by the vicarage drawing room. "Miss Marple, what an absolute pleasure! Agatha has told us so much about you. You must think terribly provincial after London." "I live in a village myself, Mrs. Clement," Miss Marple said, accepting a glass of cherry. "And I have always found that human nature remains remarkably consistent, whether in a village or a city." "How philosophical," said a new voice from the doorway. The woman who entered was perhaps 50, elegantly dressed in a deep blue frock that whispered money in every seam. Her dark hair was perfectly waved, her face carefully composed in an expression of pleasant interest. But it was her hands that caught Miss Marple's attention. Long, graceful hands encased in striking red leather gloves, which she was just removing as she crossed to the fireplace. "Mrs. Trench," Mrs. Price said with a note in her voice that might have been nervousness. "May I present my dear friend, Miss Jane Marple?" "Delighted," Mrs. Lydia Trench said, extending one bare hand. Her grip was cool and firm. "Mrs. Price has spoken of you so often. You're quite the local celebrity, I understand." "Hardly that," Miss Marple demurred. "Now, Lydia," the vicar said, emerging from his abstraction long enough to hand around a plate of biscuits. "You mustn't embarrass our guest." "I'm merely stating facts, Vicer. It's important to be accurate about such things, don't you think?" "Especially when one is dealing with," she paused delicately, "matters of trust." There was a brief, uncomfortable silence. Mrs. Clement rushed to fill it with chatter about the weather, the bazaar, the new cushions for the church pews. But Miss Marple, sipping her sherry and appearing to listen with polite attention, was noting other things. The way Mrs. Price's teacup rattled slightly in its saucer, the vicar's sudden intense interest in the carpet pattern, and most particularly, the expression on Mrs. Trench's face. Satisfaction, perhaps, or something very like it. "You must all come tomorrow, of course," Mrs. Clement said brightly. "The bazaar opens at 2. It's always such a lovely event. The whole village turns out." "I'm looking forward to it immensely," Miss Marple said truthfully. Walking back through the snow-hushed streets afterward, Mrs. Price was quiet. Miss Marple did not press her. But as they reached the cottage gate, her friend suddenly spoke. "Mrs. Trench's husband. Bernard, he died quite suddenly last April. Heart attack," the doctor said. "She's been very involved with the church since then." "Very involved indeed. Grief takes people in different ways," Miss Marple observed. "Yes," Mrs. Price said. "Yes, I suppose it does." But as Miss Marple prepared for bed later, she found herself thinking not of grief, but of those red gloves so carefully removed. She had known a housemaid once back in St. Mary who had always worn gloves when serving tea. It had taken 3 months to discover she was concealing a distinctive birthmark and the theft of Lady Ashton's silver spoons. She picked up her knitting, the needles clicking softly in the quiet room. Tomorrow there would be a bazaar and a raffle and undoubtedly a great deal of cheerful village bustle. But beneath it all, Miss Marple suspected there was something else entirely. Chapter 2. A Raffle Gone Wrong. The morning of the bazaar dawned bright and cold, with fresh snow transforming St. Mildred's churchyard into something from a Christmas card. Miss Marple, observing from Mrs. Price's breakfast table, remarked that it was the sort of day that made everyone feel virtuous simply for venturing outdoors. "Though I suspect," she added, buttering her toast with precision, "that the promise of tea and cakes will do quite as much as Christian charity to ensure a good turnout." Mrs. Price managed a distracted smile. She had been up since 6, Miss Marple knew, checking lists and efting over arrangements. The previous evening, after returning from the vicarage, she'd spent an hour on the telephone dealing with some crisis involving the white elephant stall. By 1, they were at the church hall, which adjoined St. Mildred's through a covered passage. The transformation was remarkable. Long tables draped in white cloths displayed an abundance of homemade goods, jars of marmalade glowing like amber, scarves in every conceivable shade of wool, books arranged with military precision, and cakes that would have done credit to a professional bakery. At the far end of the hall, on a separate table draped in red velvet, stood the display case containing Lady Wickham's necklace. Even from a distance, Miss Marple could see the diamonds catching the light from the overhead fixtures. A small placard announced that raffle tickets were 5 shillings each, with all proceeds going to the Church Restoration Fund. "Miss Marple, how kind of you to help." Mrs. Clement materialized at her elbow, slightly breathless. "Agatha said you might be willing to assist at the cake stall. Mrs. Henderson was meant to do it, but she's come down with a most dreadful cold." "I should be delighted," Miss Marple said, allowing herself to be guided to a table laden with Victoria sponges and gingerbread. From this vantage point, she had an excellent view of the entire hall. Mrs. Trench stood near the raffle table, elegant in a dove-gray suit, her red glove striking against the white tablecloth. She appeared to be explaining something to a young woman with fair hair and an anxious expression. This, Miss Marple learned from a whispered aside from the vicar's wife, was Miss Helen Cottrell, who worked as a secretary for the local solicitor and had volunteered to help sell raffle tickets. "Such a sweet girl," Mrs. Clement confided, though terribly shy. "Her mother died last year, and she's been rather at loose ends. Mrs. Trench has taken her under her wing, so to speak." The doors opened at 2 bars to a gratifying surge of villagers, their cheeks pink from the cold stamping snow from their boots and exclaiming over the displays. Miss Marple settled into the pleasant rhythm of cutting cake, making change, and observing. She observed, for instance, that Mrs. Trench checked her wristwatch no fewer than 3 times in the first half-hour. She observed that the vicar, meant to be circulating among his parishioners, kept drifting back to hover near the donation boxes, positioned at intervals around the hall. And she observed that Miss Cottrell, when she thought no one was looking, had a habit of touching her throat in a nervous gesture that reminded Miss Marple of a frightened rabbit. "2 slices of the walnut cake, if you please," said an elderly gentleman with magnificent whiskers. "My late wife used to make one very similar. Never could get her to share the recipe." Miss Marple wrapped the cakes in tissue paper and took his money. "The secret is often in the smallest details," she said pleasantly. "A pinch of this or that added when no one is watching." At 3, Mrs. Trench mounted a small platform and announced that the raffle would be drawn at half. There was a ripple of excitement through the crowd. Miss Marple noticed several women moving toward the raffle table, including a stout lady in an unfortunate purple hat, and a younger woman whose red gloves, though of a different shade than Mrs. Trench's, were nevertheless distinctive. "That's Mrs. Patterson," her cake's companion whispered. She'd introduced herself as Miss Lavinia Marks, a spinster who lived with her brother. "And the other is Miss Sarah Wickham, the doctor's daughter, both committee members." Of course, the hall had grown warm with the press of bodies, and someone opened a window slightly, letting in a draught of cold air that set the bunting fluttering. Miss Marple sold 3 more slices of cake and watched as Miss Cottrell, looking increasingly pale, handed out the last few raffle tickets. At 28 minutes 3, just as Mrs. Trench was reaching into the drum of ticket stubs, the lights went out. The effect was instantaneous and unsettling. The gray afternoon had already begun to darken toward evening, and though the windows admitted some one light, the interior of the hall was plunged into deep shadow. There were exclamations, a nervous laugh from somewhere near the bookstore, and the sound of something, possibly a teacup falling to the floor. "Everyone, please remain calm," the vicar's voice called out, steady despite a slight quaver. "It's merely the fuse. I'll have it sorted in a moment." Miss Marple stood very still, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the cake table. In the darkness, sounds became magnified, footsteps moving quickly across the wooden floor, the rustle of fabric, someone's sharp intake of breath, and something else. Was that a door opening? The one that led to the passage connecting the hall to the church? The darkness lasted perhaps 90 seconds, though it felt longer. When the lights blazed on again, there was a collective sigh of relief, followed immediately by confusion. Miss Cottrell stood frozen near the raffle table, her face chalk white. Mrs. Trench had both hands pressed against the red velvet cloth, and the display case, which had been securely locked, now stood open. The necklace was gone. For a moment, no one seemed to comprehend what they were seeing. Then Mrs. Trench's voice cut through the murmur of conversation, sharp and clear. The necklace. Someone's taken Lady Wickham's necklace. The hall erupted. Women rushed forward, then back, uncertain whether to approach or retreat. The vicar raised his hands, calling for order. Mrs. Price looked as though she might faint. And Miss Cottrell, her voice shaking, said loudly enough for those nearby to hear, "I saw someone." Just before the lights went out, someone in red gloves reaching toward the table. Every eye in the hall seemed to turn as though pulled by invisible strings to Mrs. Trench's hands. "That's absurd," Mrs. Trench said, her composure intact, though her voice had acquired an edge. "I was nowhere near the case. I was standing beside it, certainly, but I didn't touch it." "Neither did I," said Mrs. Patterson, removing her own red gloves with an emphatic gesture. "I was at the bookstall." Miss Wickham, the doctor's daughter, looked down at her hands as though seeing the red gloves for the first time. "I was helping at the jam table," she said faintly. The vicar had hurried to the display case and was examining it with bewildered concern. "The lock hasn't been forced? Someone must have had a key or picked it," suggested an eager voice from the crowd. A young man who Miss Marple did not recognize. "We must telephone the police," Mrs. Price said, having recovered her voice, if not her color. "At once." As confusion reigned and villagers clustered in anxious knots, Miss Marple remained at her post behind the cake table. She was thinking about several things: the sound of that door opening, the precise timing of the lights failing, and most particularly, the expression she had glimpsed on Mrs. Trench's face in the instant before she had announced the theft. It had not been surprise. It had been something else entirely. Chapter 3, The Missing Necklace. The police arrived within the hour in the person of Constable Watkins. Sturdy young man who seemed acutely aware that a theft of several hundred worth of diamonds was rather beyond his usual remit of bicycle thefts and the occasional poaching incident. "Now then," he said, producing a notebook with an air of determination, "I'll need statements from everyone who was near the display case when the lights failed." Miss Marple, having been relieved of her cake stole duties, accepted a cup of tea from Mrs. Clement and settled herself on a chair near the book table. From here she could observe without appearing to do so, a skill she had perfected over many years of village life. The vicar had asked most of the crowd to leave, though several committee members remained along with a handful of witnesses whom Constable Watkins deemed essential. Miss Cottrell sat apart from the others, twisting a handkerchief between her fingers. Mrs. Trench stood by the window, her posture erect, her face composed into an expression of patient cooperation. "Miss Cottrell," the constable said, consulting his notes, "you mentioned seeing someone in red gloves near the case." The young woman looked up, Harry's red-rimmed. "Yes, that is." "I think so." It was just as the lights began to flicker before they went out completely. "I saw a hand reaching toward the table. The gloves were red. I'm certain of that." "And you're quite sure it wasn't your own hand you saw?" Mrs. Trench asked pleasantly. "One can become confused in such circumstances." Miss Cottrell flushed. "I wasn't wearing gloves at all. Mine are brown in any case, and they're in my coat pocket." Several ladies here were wearing red gloves, the vicar said unhappily. Mrs. Price managed a distracted smile. She had been up since 6th hour, Miss Marple knew, checking lists and FTing over arrangements. The previous evening after returning from the vicarage, she'd spent an hour on the telephone dealing with some crisis involving the White Elephant stall. By 1, they were at the church hall, which adjoined St. Mildred's through a covered passage. The transformation was remarkable. Long tables draped in white cloths displayed an abundance of homemade goods, jars of marmalade glowing like amber, scarves in every conceivable shade of wool, books arranged with military precision, and cakes that would have done credit to a professional bakery. At the far end of the hall, on a separate table draped in red velvet, stood the display case containing Lady Wickham's necklace. Even from a distance, Miss Marple could see the diamonds catching the light from the overhead fixtures. A small placard announced that raffle tickets were 5 shillings each, with all proceeds going to the church restoration fund. "Miss Marple, how kind of you to help." Mrs. Clement materialized at her elbow, slightly breathless. "Agatha said you might be willing to assist at the cake stall. Mrs. Henderson was meant to do it, but she's come down with a most dreadful cold." "I should be delighted," Miss Marple said, allowing herself to be guided to a table laden with Victoria sponges and gingerbread. From this vantage point, she had an excellent view of the entire hall. Mrs. Trench stood near the raffle table, elegant in a dove-gray suit, her red glove striking against the white tablecloth. She appeared to be explaining something to a young woman with fair hair and an anxious expression. This, Miss Marple learned from a whispered aside from the vicar's wife, was Miss Helen Cottrell, who worked as a secretary for the local solicitor and had volunteered to help sell raffle tickets. "Such a sweet girl," Mrs. Clement confided, though terribly shy. "Her mother died last year, and she's been rather at loose ends. Mrs. Trench has taken her under her wing, so to speak." The doors opened at 2 wire to a gratifying surge of villagers, their cheeks pink from the cold stamping snow from their boots and exclaiming over the displays. Miss Marple settled into the pleasant rhythm of cutting cake, making change, and observing. She observed, for instance, that Mrs. Trench checked her wristwatch no fewer than 3 times in the first half hour. She observed that the vicar, meant to be circulating among his parishioners, kept drifting back to hover near the donation boxes, positioned at intervals around the hall. And she observed that Miss Cottrell, when she thought no one was looking, had a habit of touching her throat in a nervous gesture that reminded Miss Marple of a frightened rabbit. "2 slices of the walnut cake, if you please," said an elderly gentleman with magnificent whiskers. "My late wife used to make one very similar. Never could get her to share the recipe." Miss Marple wrapped the cakes in tissue paper and took his money. "The secret is often in the smallest details," she said pleasantly. "A pinch of this or that added when no one is watching." At 3 bow, Mrs. Trench mounted a small platform and announced that the raffle would be drawn at half. There was a ripple of excitement through the crowd. Miss Marple noticed several women moving toward the raffle table, including a stout lady in an unfortunate purple hat, and a younger woman whose red gloves, though of a different shade than Mrs. Trench's, were nevertheless distinctive. "That's Mrs. Patterson," her cake's companion whispered. She'd introduced herself as Miss Lavinia Marks, a spinster who lived with her brother. "And the other is Miss Sarah Wickham, the doctor's daughter." Both committee members. Of course, the hall had grown warm with the press of bodies, and someone opened a window slightly, letting in a draft of cold air that set the bunting fluttering. Miss Marple sold 3 more slices of cake, and watched as Miss Cottrell, looking increasingly pale, handed out the last few raffle tickets. At 28 minutes 3, just as Mrs. Trench was reaching into the drum of ticket stubs, the lights went out. The effect was instantaneous and unsettling. The gray afternoon had already begun to darken toward evening, and though the windows admitted some light, the interior of the hall was plunged into deep shadow. There were exclamations, a nervous laugh from somewhere near the bookstore, and the sound of something, possibly a teacup falling to the floor. Everyone, Please remain calm." The vicar's voice called out steady, despite a slight quaver. "It's merely the fuse. I'll have it sorted in a moment." Miss Marple stood very still, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the cake table. In the darkness, sounds became magnified. Footsteps moving quickly across the wooden floor, the rustle of fabric, someone's sharp intake of breath, and something else. Was that a door opening? The one that led to the passage connecting the hall to the church? The darkness lasted perhaps 90 seconds, though it felt longer. When the lights blazed on again, there was a collective sigh of relief, followed immediately by confusion. Miss Cottrell stood frozen near the raffle table, her face chalk white. Mrs. Trench had both hands pressed against the red velvet cloth, and the display case, which had been securely locked, now stood open. The necklace was gone. For a moment, no one seemed to comprehend what they were seeing. Then Mrs. Trench's voice cut through the murmur of conversation, sharp and clear. "The necklace. Someone's taken Lady Wickham's necklace." The hall erupted. Women rushed forward, then back, uncertain whether to approach or retreat. The vicar raised his hands, calling for order. Mrs. Price looked as though she might faint. And Miss Cottrell, her voice shaking, said loudly enough for those nearby to hear, "I saw someone." Just before the lights went out, someone in red gloves reaching toward the table. Every eye in the hall seemed to turn as though pulled by invisible strings to Mrs. Trench's hands. "That's absurd," Mrs. Trench said, her composure intact, though her voice had acquired an edge. "I was nowhere near the case. I was standing beside it, certainly, but I didn't touch it." "Neither did I," said Mrs. Patterson, removing her own red gloves with an emphatic gesture. "I was at the bookstall." Miss Wickham, the doctor's daughter, looked down at her hands as though seeing the red gloves for the first time. "I was helping at the jam table," she said faintly. The vicar had hurried to the display case and was examining it with bewildered concern. "The lock hasn't been forced. Someone must have had a key or picked it," suggested an eager voice from the crowd, a young man who Miss Marple did not recognize. "We must telephone the police," Mrs. Price said, having recovered her voice, if not her color. "At once." As confusion reigned and villagers clustered in anxious knots, Miss Marple remained at her post behind the cake table. She was thinking about several things: the sound of that door opening, the precise timing of the lights failing, and most particularly the expression she had glimpsed on Mrs. Trench's face in the instant before she had announced the theft. It had not been surprise. It had been something else entirely. Chapter 3: The Missing Necklace. The police arrived within the hour in the person of Constable Watkins. Sturdy young man who seemed acutely aware that a theft of several hundred worth of diamonds was rather beyond his usual remit of bicycle thefts and the occasional poaching incident. "Now then," he said, producing a notebook with an air of determination. "I'll need statements from everyone who was near the display case when the lights failed." Miss Marple, having been relieved of her cake stole duties, accepted a cup of tea from Mrs. Clement and settled herself on a chair near the book table. From here she could observe without appearing to do so, a skill she had perfected over many years of village life. The vicar had asked most of the crowd to leave, though several committee members remained along with a handful of witnesses whom Constable Watkins deemed essential. Miss Cottrell sat apart from the others, twisting a handkerchief between her fingers. Mrs. Trench stood by the window, her posture erect, her face composed into an expression of patient cooperation. "Miss Cottrell," the constable said, consulting his notes, "you mentioned seeing someone in red gloves near the case." The young woman looked up, her ears red-rimmed. "Yes, that is, I think so. It was just as the lights began to flicker before they went out completely. I saw a hand reaching toward the table. The gloves were red. I'm certain of that." "And you're quite sure it wasn't your own hand you saw?" Mrs. Trench asked pleasantly. "One can become confused in such circumstances." Miss Cottrell flushed. "I wasn't wearing gloves at all. Mine are brown in any case, and they're in my coat pocket. Several ladies here were wearing red gloves, the vicer said unhappily. Though not thoroughly. The donation boxes had been examined, these stalls checked. Nothing had been found. Might I ask? Miss Marple said quietly, her voice cutting through the chatter with unexpected clarity. Who held the key to the display case? There was a brief silence. The vicer cleared his throat. Mrs. Trench, as treasurer, was responsible for the security arrangements. She had the key. And it remained in your possession throughout, Miss Marple asked, looking at Mrs. Trench with mild interest. It did, Mrs. Trench said firmly. I had Eton a chain around my neck beneath my blouse. I checked the case this morning and locked it myself. I certainly didn't open it during the bazaar. Yet someone did, Mrs. Price said faintly. Unless, the constable said, brightening slightly at his own deduction, the thief picked the lock. That would explain how it was opened without the key. Miss Marple tilted her head thoughtfully. I wonder lockpicking requires both skill and time and 90 seconds in complete darkness with people all around. You know about lockpicking, Miss Marple? Constable Watkins asked, looking startled. I read rather widely, Miss Marple said. And I once knew a housemaid who had quite a talent for opening locked trunks. It took her several minutes, even in good light, and she'd had considerable practice. Mrs. Trench's expression remained impassive, but something flickered in her eyes. Calculation, perhaps, or weariness. The point is, she said crisply, the necklace is missing, and standing about theorizing won't recover it. Constable, surely you should be searching the grounds. The thief might have slipped outside during the confusion. In this weather, Mrs. Clement protested. They'd leave footprints in the snow. Which is precisely why we should look for them, Mrs. Trench counted. But when they did venture outside, the snow around the hall showed only the trampled confusion of many feet coming and going. If anyone had run from the building with the necklace, their tracks were indistinguishable from dozens of others. I still say Helen saw something, Mrs. Patterson declared when they had returned to the hall, stamping snow from their shoes. Perhaps not who took it, but something suspicious. Miss Cottrell, who had been growing increasingly distressed, suddenly stood up. I know what I saw. I'm not mistaken, and I'm not confused. Someone in red gloves reached toward that case just before the lights went out. I saw it clearly. But which someone? The vicer asked helplessly. That, said Miss Marple, setting down her teacup, is indeed the question. She had noticed something during the search outside. Or rather the absence of something. Mrs. Trench had accompanied them to the door, but had not ventured into the snow. She had claimed her shoes were unsuitable, which was perfectly reasonable. But Miss Marple had observed that she kept her hands in her pockets throughout, and when she finally withdrew them, the red gloves were no longer visible. It was a small thing, perhaps meaningless. But Miss Marple had long ago learned that small things were often the hinges upon which large doors swung. As dusk gathered and the committee members began to disperse, Constable Watkins promised to return in the morning with the inspector from the market town. The necklace, he assured them, would certainly be recovered. These things always came to light. Miss Marple walking back through the snow with Mrs. Price was less certain. The theft had been carefully planned. Of that she was now convinced. The timing of the power failure, the confusion about the red gloves, the absence of obvious evidence. Someone had thought this through quite thoroughly. I don't understand it, Mrs. Price said miserably. Who would do such a thing? And poor Helen, having suspicion fall on her that way. She's such a timid creature. Timid creatures, Miss Marple observed, can sometimes surprise one. Though in this case I rather think Miss Cottrell's distress is genuine. You believe her, then, about seeing someone? I believe she saw what she says she saw, Miss Marple said carefully. Whether she understood what she was seeing is another matter entirely. That night, unable to sleep, Miss Marple sat by her window, looking out at the church tower rising against the star-pricked sky. Somewhere in Waverly Edge, a diamond necklace lay hidden, and somewhere she suspected there was a secret considerably more valuable than diamonds. A secret that someone was willing to steal and perhaps to do worse to protect. The snow had stopped falling, and the village lay silent and white beneath the winter moon. Chapter 4. Whispers in the Vestry. The morning brought no fresh snow, but a hard frost that turned the world to crystal. Miss Marple woke early, as was her habit, and found Mrs. Price already in the kitchen, her face drawn with worry and lack of sleep. "I've had the most dreadful night," she confessed over breakfast. Thinking about the necklace and poor Lady Whittam's generosity being repaid in such a fashion. "And the audit, Jane. The bishop's office will want to know every detail of the bazaar funds now. It's going to look most irregular." Miss Marple buttered her toast with her usual precision. "When is the audit scheduled?" "Next month, February 15th. Mrs. Price poured tea with a hand that trembled slightly. "Lydia has been managing the account since her husband passed. She's been meticulous about it." "I'll give her that. Every penny accounted for. I'm sure that must be a great comfort," Miss Marple said mildly. After breakfast, she suggested a walk to the church. The cold air would be beneficial, she said, and she wished to see the snowdrops that Mrs. Price had mentioned were beginning to push through near the south wall. Mrs. Price, grateful for the company, agreed readily. They found the church door unlocked, which surprised Mrs. Price. The vicar usually keeps it locked during the weekend winter, too expensive to heat. Inside, St. Mildred's was dim and smelled of old stone, beeswax, and the faint mustiness of ancient hymn books. Their footsteps echoed on the flagstones as they walked slowly up the aisle. Miss Marple paused to admire a memorial bronze, running her gloved fingers lightly over the inscription. It was then that they heard the voices. They came from the vestry, low and urgent. Miss Marple and Mrs. Price exchanged glances. Without speaking, by mutual accord, they moved quietly toward the sound. The vestry door stood slightly ajar, and through the gap 2 women were visible. Mrs. Trench and Mrs. Patterson stood close together, their voices tight with tension. "I'm telling you, it had to be done," Mrs. Trench was saying. "There was no other way to manage it. You know perfectly well what would have happened otherwise." "But the girl saw something," Mrs. Patterson hissed. "She's not going to let it rest, Lydia. You know how she is, all conscience and no sense. Helen will hold her tongue if she knows what's good for her. I've made that perfectly clear. And if she doesn't," there was a pause. When Mrs. Trench spoke again, her voice had dropped so low that Miss Marple had to strain to hear it. "Then we shall have to take steps to ensure she does. The reputation of the church is at stake. We can't let one silly girl's scruples ruin everything. But the necklace will be dealt with appropriately. Trust me, Constance, I've managed more difficult situations than this. You can't hide a theft forever naturally, but one can certainly manage the consequences." Mrs. Patterson made a sound that might have been agreement or doubt. "I hope you're right. If Bernard were still alive, Bernard is dead." Mrs. Trench's voice was suddenly sharp. "And we must manage as best we can without him. Now I must go. I'm expected at the vicarage at 11. Miss Marple and Mrs. Price barely had time to retreat behind a pillar before the vestry door opened fully, and Mrs. Trench emerged, followed by Mrs. Patterson. Neither woman glanced in their direction as they walked quickly toward the main door, the heels clicking on the stone floor. When the door had closed behind them, Mrs. Price let out a breath she seemed to have been holding. "Jane, what on earth do you suppose that was about?" "I rather think," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "that it was about a good deal more than a stolen necklace." They returned to the cottage, and Miss Marple spent an hour with her knitting, while Mrs. Price made telephone calls related to the bazaar's aftermath. But her needles moved automatically, while her mind was elsewhere, piecing together fragments of conversation and observation. at 3 having declined Mrs. Price's suggestion of arrest. Miss Marple announced that she would take a turn around the village. She wished to post a letter to her nephew, she said, and perhaps purchase some wool from the haberdashery that Mrs. Price had recommended. The post office was also the village shop, a cramped establishment presided over by a sharp-eyed woman of about 60, who introduced herself as Mrs. Dibbs. "Terrible business about the necklace," she said the moment Miss Marple had purchased her stamps. "The whole village is talking of nothing else. They say young Helen Cottrell is under suspicion." "Indeed," Miss Marple said encouragingly. "Well, she was standing right there when it happened, wasn't she? And making up stories about red gloves, as if half the ladies in the village don't own a pair." Mrs. Dibbs leaned forward confidently. "Though between you and me, Miss, I've always thought there was something a bit too convenient about Mr. Trench's passing." Miss Marple's hand selecting a skin of pale blue wool paused almost imperceptibly. "Convenient dying so sudden like that, just when there was all that talk about the church funds. Mind you, I'm not one to gossip, but my sister's friend Mrs. Bates cleans for the vicar, and she says there was some question about the accounts before Mr. Trench took ill. Went to his grave without answering them, didn't he?" "How very sad," Miss Marple murmured. "And now his widow manages everything. Keeps it all very close, she does. Won't let anyone else near the books, not even the vicar. Says it's too complicated for anyone who isn't trained in accounting." Mrs. Dibbs sniffed. "Her husband was an accountant, of course, so I suppose she picked up a thing or two." Miss Marple purchased her wool and walked slowly back through the village. The pieces were beginning to arrange themselves into a pattern, though the picture was not yet complete. Bernard Trench, who had died suddenly, just as questions were being raised about the church accounts. Lydia Trench, who had taken over those same accounts and guarded them zealously. An audit scheduled for next month, and now a valuable necklace stolen under circumstances that suggested both planning and desperation. She was so absorbed in her thoughts that she nearly collided with Miss Cottrell, who was hurrying along the pavement with her head down, a shopping basket over her arm. "Oh, I beg your pardon," the young woman said, looking up with a startled expression that turned to recognition. "You're Miss Marple, aren't you?" "Mrs. Price's friend?" "I am indeed," Miss Marple said warmly. "And you are Miss Cottrell. I saw you at the bazaar yesterday, though we weren't properly introduced." Helen Cottrell's face, which had been pale before, went almost white. "Yes, I was selling raffle tickets before it happened. Such an unfortunate business," Miss Marple said. "You must have been very distressed." I am." The girl's voice trembled. "And now everyone thinks they believe I had something to do with it. But I didn't, Miss Marple. I swear I didn't. I only saw what I saw, and I couldn't lie about it, could I? Even though Mrs. Trench warned me that." She stopped abruptly, pressing her gloved hand to her mouth. "Mrs. Trench warned you?" Miss Marple prompted gently. But the moment of confidence had passed. "I shouldn't have said anything. I must go. My employer will be wondering where I am." She hurried away, almost running, leaving Miss Marple standing on the pavement. But she had said enough. Mrs. Trench had warned her. About what? About accusing anyone of theft, or about something else entirely. That evening after dinner, Miss Marple sat with Mrs. Price in the sitting room while her friend worked on the accounts for the Women's Institute. "Agatha," Miss Marple said, looking up from her knitting, "when did you say Mr. Trench passed away?" "Last April. The 23rd, I believe. Very sudden. He collapsed in his garden." "And the questions about the church accounts that Mrs. Dibbs mentioned?" Mrs. Price looked uncomfortable. "There was some concern. A few discrepancies that the vicar noticed, but Bernard explained them satisfactorily before he died. At least Lydia said he had. She took over the books immediately afterward, said it would help her to stay occupied during her grief." "How very industrious of her," Miss Marple said. She bent over her knitting again, but her mind was far from the cable pattern in her hands. She was thinking about grief and industry and the many ways that people manage to hide uncomfortable, truths beneath layers of respectability, in charitable work, and she was thinking about a raffle. Ticket stub torn in half and hidden under a tablecloth. That the constable had mentioned finding a stub that matched no ticket. Sold to the public. The church bell struck 9. Their sound clear and cold in the winter night. Chapter 5, The Woman with the Red Gloves. The telegram arrived just after breakfast, delivered by a boy on a bicycle, who seemed disappointed that it contained no dramatic news. Mrs. Price read it twice, her face creasing with concern. "It's from my sister in Bath. She's taken ill and asked if I might come at once." She looked at Miss Marple apologetically. "I'm so dreadfully sorry, Jane. What horrible timing with everything that's happened." "You must go, of course," Miss Marple said firmly. "Your sister needs you. I shall manage perfectly well here. But to leave you alone, and with all this unpleasantness about the necklace—" "I am quite accustomed to my own company," Miss Marple assured her. "And I have my knitting to occupy me. When do you leave?" "There's a train at 11. If I hurry, I can just make it." Mrs. Price was already mentally packing her breakfast forgotten. "I should be back tomorrow evening or the day after at the latest." By 10, Miss Marple had waved her friend off in a taxi and found herself mistress of the cottage. She tidied the breakfast things, fed the cat that had appeared on the doorstep with a presumptuous air of ownership, and then put on her hat and coat. A visit to the church hall, she thought, might prove instructive. The hall was locked, but the vicar, whom she encountered in the churchyard examining the state of a crumbling gravestone, was happy to let her in. "I thought I might retrieve the recipe book from the cake stall," she explained. Mrs. Price mentioned there were several contributions that ought to be returned to their owners. This was not entirely true, but it served its purpose. The vicar unlocked the door and left her to it, returning to his examination of 18th century mortality. The hall looked forlorn in the gray morning light. The stalls still in place, but stripped of their festive atmosphere. Miss Marple moved slowly among the tables, her eyes taking in details that had been obscured by the crowd and confusion of the bazaar. She examined the raffle table particularly carefully, running her fingers along the red velvet cloth, noting how it had been arranged. The display case stood empty now, its door still open. She studied the lock, simple but adequate, and observed that the key would indeed need to be turned to open it. No amount of jostling or accident would spring it open. It was beneath the table that she found what she was looking for. The torn raffle ticket stub lay half hidden in a crack between two floorboards. Constable Watkins had mentioned finding own, but this appeared to be a second piece, or perhaps part of the same ticket. Miss Marple retrieved it carefully, noting the number 247. She placed it in her handbag and continued her inspection. The passage connecting the hall to the church was narrow and cold, lined with coat hooks and cluttered with the accumulation of years. The fuse box hung on the wall just inside the door, exactly as the vicar had described. Miss Marple examined it thoughtfully, noting that it would take perhaps 15 seconds to reach it from the hall, another 5 to reset the switch. That left more than a minute unaccounted for. She was just emerging from the passage when she heard voices approaching the hall. Quickly, Miss Marple positioned herself by the bookstore, apparently absorbed in examining a volume of sermons. The door opened to admit Mrs. Trench and Helen Cottrell. They stopped short at the sight of Miss Marple. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Trench said, her voice carefully pleasant, "I didn't expect to find anyone here." "Mrs. Price asked me to collect a few items before she left for Bath," Miss Marple said mildly. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all." Mrs. Trench's eyes swept the hall, missing nothing. "I came to ensure everything was properly secured. Helen was kind enough to accompany me." Helen Cottrell said nothing, but Miss Marple noted that her face was blotchy, as though she'd been crying recently, her hands twisted together in a familiar gesture of distress. "Such a shocking business," Miss Marple observed, returning the sermon book to its place. "I don't suppose the police have made any progress." The inspector is coming from Denham this afternoon, Mrs. Trench said. No doubt Hell wished to question everyone again. These local constables are well-meaning but hardly equipped for serious crime. And yet Miss Marple said gently, "One wonders whether it is quite as serious as all that. The necklace must be somewhere nearby. Surely it could hardly have been spirited away by magic." Mrs. Trench's expression remained composed, but something flickered in her eyes. "You're quite right, of course. I expect it will turn up in some perfectly ordinary place, and we shall all feel rather foolish." "That would certainly be the most comfortable outcome," Miss Marple agreed. She noticed that Mrs. Trench was wearing different gloves today. Black ones, elegant but unremarkable. Helen Cottrell's hands were bare, red with cold. "Miss Cottrell, you look chilled," Miss Marple said. "Would you care to walk back to the village with me?" "I'm just going that way, and we might stop for tea at the tea shop." The girl looked uncertain, glancing at Mrs. Trench as though seeking permission. Mrs. Trench's smile remained fixed. "What a kind thought, Miss Marple. But I'm afraid Helen and I have matters to discuss. Church business, perhaps another time." "Of course," Miss Marple said pleasantly. As she left the hall and made her way back through the churchyard, she was conscious of being watched. Turning at the gate, she saw Mrs. Trench framed in the hall doorway, her face unreadable at this distance. Miss Marple continued her walk, turning not toward the village proper, but taking a path that led past the vicarage. It was here, quite by chance, that she encountered Mrs. Clement in her garden, cutting evergreen branches for the church. "Miss Marple, how fortunate! I was hoping to see you." "The most dreadful thing has happened." Miss Marple's expression remained calm, though her attention sharpened. "Indeed, it's Helen Cottrell. She was found in the church hall early this morning by the cleaning woman. There had been an accident. A tea tray overturned, and Helen had fallen, struck her head on the corner of a table. The world seemed to slow and crystallize around Miss Marple, each detail suddenly sharp and significant. "Is she dead?" Mrs. Clement's voice caught. "The doctor says she must have come to the hall last evening, perhaps to collect something she'd forgotten. The floor was wet where melted snow had been tracked in. She slipped. Poor thing. So young and such a terrible, tragic accident." Miss Marple stood very still, her gloved hands gripping her handbag. An accident. How very convenient. She thought of the frightened girl she'd seen just moments ago with her blotchy face and nervous hands. But that had been yesterday. This morning, Helen Cottrell had been dead. "When exactly was she discovered?" Miss Marple asked quietly. "Just after 7, Mrs. Bates, the cleaner, found her. The constable was called at once." Mrs. Clement lowered her voice. "Between you and me, there was some talk." Helen's wrist bore marks as though someone had gripped it rather hard. "But the doctor says that's not unusual in a fall. One grasps at things, tries to catch oneself." Miss Marple thought of red gloves and lies and whispered conversations in the vestry. How very tragic, she said. But she did not believe in accidents. Not anymore. Chapter 6, Tea and Alibis. The news of Helen Cottrell's death spread through Waverly Edge with the peculiar swiftness of village tragedy. By afternoon, when Miss Marple made her way to the vicarage at Mrs. Clement's invitation, she found the committee assembled in a state of collective shock. Mrs. Trench sat by the fire, her posture as erect as ever, though Miss Marple detected a certain rigidity that suggested effort rather than ease. Mrs. Patterson occupied the sofa, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. Miss Wickham, the doctor's daughter, stood by the window, her face pale. The vicar moved among them, offering tea with the helpless air of a man confronting grief beyond his pastoral experience. "So dreadful," Mrs. Clement was saying as Miss Marple entered. "So utterly dreadful, that poor child to think she was lying there all night." "The doctor was quite certain it was an accident?" Miss Marple asked, accepting a cup of tea. "Quite certain," Mrs. Trench said firmly. Dr. Wickham examined her most thoroughly. "A tragic fall, nothing more." The floor was slippery from the snow. Miss Marple sipped her tea. I understood the hall was locked after the bazaar. There was the briefest pause before the vicar spoke. Helen had her own key. As a volunteer, she often helped with preparations. She must have gone back for something and slipped on the wet floor in the darkness. In the darkness, Miss Marple said mildly, "Were the lights not working?" "The fuse had gone again," Mrs. Patterson said. "That wretched wiring, it's a death trap, that hall. The church council has been saying so for years." "How very unfortunate that it should fail twice in as many days," Miss Marple observed. Mrs. Trench's teacup rattled almost imperceptibly against its saucer. "These old buildings are unpredictable. One must simply accept these inconveniences." The inspector from Denham, a methodical man named Graves, arrived shortly thereafter and requested statements from those who had been present at the bazaar. Miss Marple listened with quiet attention, as each woman recounted her movements during the crucial moments when the lights had failed. Mrs. Trench's account was crisp and precise. She had been standing beside the raffle table, preparing to draw the winning ticket. When the lights went out, she'd remained where she was, assuming the vicar would restore them momentarily. She had heard movement around her, but could distinguish nothing in the darkness. When the lights returned, she had immediately noticed the open display case. "And you were with the vicar when the lights failed?" Inspector Graves asked, consulting his notes. "I was near the raffle table," Mrs. Trench corrected. "The vicar was somewhere across the hall. He went to fix the fuse." The vicar nodded his confirmation. "I was by the donation boxes at the far end. When the lights went out, I made my way to the passage. The fuse box is just inside the door to the church. It took perhaps a minute, perhaps a bit more, to reset it." "And Mrs. Price," the inspector asked, turning to Miss Marple. "I understand she was organizing the event." "Mrs. Price was at the cake store with me," Miss Marple said. "We remained together throughout." Mrs. Patterson, when questioned, claimed she had been at the bookstore on the opposite side of the hall. Miss Wickham said she had been helping at the jam table, though when pressed admitted no one could confirm this, as her companion had left to fetch more change just before the lights failed. "And you, Mrs. Patterson," Inspector Graves said, "you were wearing red gloves that day." "I was," Mrs. Patterson said stiffly, as were several other ladies. "I failed to see the relevance." Miss Cottrell claimed to have seen someone in red gloves near the display case. "The poor girl was mistaken," Mrs. Trench said. "Understandably so, given the confusion, perhaps." The inspector made a note. "Though it's unfortunate we cannot ask her about it now." The words hung in there heavy with implication. Mrs. Trench's face remained impassive, but Miss Marple saw her hands tighten in her lap. "Inspector," Mrs. Clement said, her voice uncertain, "surely you don't think Helen's death was anything other than an accident?" "I think," Inspector Graves said carefully, "that it's a remarkable coincidence. A young woman witnesses a theft, makes an accusation, and within 24 hours is found dead. Even if her death was accidental, the timing is troubling. Coincidences do occur," Mrs. Trench said coolly. "Tragic ones occasionally." Miss Marple sat down her teacup with a gentle click. "Might I ask who locked the hall after the bazaar yesterday?" The vicar looked uncomfortable. "I did, naturally. Or rather, I thought I did. I'm quite certain I locked the door. And the key," Miss Marple prompted, "hangs in the vestry along with all the other church keys. Anyone with access to the church could have taken it." "How many people have keys to the church itself?" The vicar counted on his fingers. "Myself, my wife, Mrs. Trench's treasurer, the organist, and the sexton. 5 in all." Miss Marple absorbed this information quietly. 5 people with legitimate access, any of whom could have entered the hall the previous evening, or perhaps someone who didn't need a key at all because they had never left. "Inspector," she said, "when Miss Cottrell was found this morning, was there any indication of what she might have been doing in the hall?" Inspector Graves consulted his notes. The tea things were laid out on a table near the entrance. Mrs. Bates, the cleaner, says they weren't there when she locked up the previous afternoon. It appears Miss Cottrell was preparing tea, though. Why, we can't say. Perhaps she was expecting someone, Miss Marple suggested. Mrs. Trench stood abruptly. I really must go. I have correspondence to attend to. If you require anything further, Inspector, you know where to find me. She left with her characteristic poise. Though Miss Marple noticed, she avoided meeting anyone's eyes as she departed. The gathering broke up shortly thereafter, the women dispersing to their homes with backward glances and hushed conversations. Miss Marple walked back to Mrs. Price's cottage in the gathering dusk, her mind working steadily through the accumulated facts. Helen Cottrell had gone to the hall the previous evening, apparently to meet someone. She'd prepared tea, which suggested an appointment, not a casual visit, and that meeting had ended in her death. The marks on her wrist, dismissed by the doctor as evidence of a fall, told a different story to Miss Marple. She had seen similar marks once before, on the wrist of a maid, who had tried to resist being pushed down a flight of stairs. The maid had survived to tell the truth. Helen Cottrell had not been so fortunate. Back at the cottage, Miss Marple made herself a simple supper and sat by the fire with her knitting. The cat which had adopted her in Mrs. Price's absence purred on her lap, but her needles moved slowly and her gaze was distant. She was thinking about tea and alibis, about red gloves and torn raffle tickets, about a necklace that had vanished and a young woman who had seen too much. And she was thinking about Mrs. Trench, who had been so very certain that Helen's death was an accident, and who had left the vicarage with such unseemly haste. The fire crackled softly. Outside, fresh snow began to fall, covering the village in a blanket of deceptive innocence. Chapter 7. An Unopened Donation Box. The following morning brought Mrs. Price's return earlier than expected. Her sister's illness had proved less serious than feared. A bout of influenza rather than anything grave, and she had been eager to return to Waverley Edge, particularly after receiving a telephone call from Mrs. Clement detailing the tragedy. Poor Helen, she said over breakfast, her eyes red from crying. I can hardly believe it. Such a quiet, gentle creature to die in such a way. Miss Marple buttered her toast with deliberation. I wonder, Agatha, whether you might need help sorting the bazaar donations. There must be a considerable amount of tidying up to do. Mrs. Price looked grateful for the distraction. That's kind of you, Jane. The donation boxes are still at the hall, waiting to be counted and forwarded to their various causes. I suppose someone ought to attend to it, though it seems rather heartless to be thinking of money at a time like this. Practical matters must be addressed regardless of sentiment, Miss Marple said. And I find that keeping occupied is often the best remedy for distress. They arrived at the hall shortly after 10 mind. The vicar had agreed to let them in, though he seemed distracted and troubled. The place where Helen Cottrell had fallen had been marked with chalk by the police, a stark outline that made Mrs. Price turn away with a small sound of distress. I'll make us some tea, she said, hurrying toward the small kitchen at the back of the hall. Miss Marple moved methodically through the remaining bazaar items, making lists and sorting donations. There were 3 sealed tins designated for different missionary funds, a wooden box for the church restoration, and a locked cash box containing the proceeds from the various stalls. It was the tin-marked Overseas Mission Fund that drew her particular attention. It was heavier than the others, and when she shook it gently, something shifted inside with a solid weight that seemed inconsistent with loose coins. Agatha, she called, do you have the key to the donation tins? Mrs. Price emerged from the kitchen, drying her hands on a tea towel. The committee members each have one. I have mine here. She produced a small key from her handbag. Why do you ask? Thiston feels rather full. I thought we might count its contents while we're here. The key turned smoothly in the lock. Miss Marple lifted the lid and looked inside. Beneath a thin layer of coins lay those missing necklace, its diamonds catching the light from the overhead fixtures. And beneath the necklace, folded carefully, was a sheet of notepaper covered in a round, careful hand. Mrs. Price gasped. The necklace! But how? Jane, we must telephone the police at once. Inanimate, Miss Marple said quietly. She lifted out the necklace with careful fingers, then unfolded the note beneath it. The writing was slightly shaky, as though penned under emotional strain, but perfectly legible. Forgive me, I could not let them ruin another life. It was unsigned, but Miss Marple's practiced eye recognized the hand. She had seen Helen Cottrell's signature on the raffle tickets. Neat and precise. This was the same hand rendered less steady by distress. It's Helen's writing, Mrs. Price said, reading over her shoulder. But Jane, what does it mean? Another life? Whose life? Miss Marple carefully refolded the note and placed it with the necklace on the table. I think it means that Helen Cottrell knew far more about the theft than anyone realized, and I think she paid for that knowledge with her life. You can't mean, surely you're not suggesting her death wasn't an accident. I'm suggesting, Miss Marple said gently, that we should inform Inspector Graves immediately. This note raises rather significant questions. The inspector arrived within the hour, his expression grim as he examined the necklace and the note. This changes everything. If Miss Cottrell placed the necklace here herself with this note, it suggests she either stole it or knew who did, or Miss Marple said that she was protecting someone. Inspector Graves looked at her sharply. What makes you say that? The wording. I could not let them ruin another life. Not I couldn't resist the temptation or I needed the money. This reads as an act of sacrifice, not of greed. But whose life was she protecting? Miss Marple was silent for a moment, her mind arranging pieces of information like the stitches in her knitting, each one connected to the next, forming a pattern. I think we must look at who stood to be ruined by the discovery of the theft, or rather by what the theft was meant to conceal. The church accounts, Mrs. Price said suddenly. Jane, you don't think? I think, Miss Marple said carefully, that we should examine the donation records very thoroughly. Inspector, might I ask whether you've investigated the financial circumstances of the committee members? Inspector Graves frowned. We've had no reason to? Why would we? Because a necklace worth several hundred has been stolen and then hidden in a donation box. Because a young woman who witnessed something during the theft is now dead, and because there is an audit of the church account scheduled for next month. Miss Marple paused. I believe these facts are connected. The inspector's expression shifted from skepticism to interest. You think someone embezzled from the church and staged the theft to cover it up? I think it's a possibility worth exploring. Mrs. Price had gone very pale. Bernard Trench managed the accounts before his death. There were questions, but Lydia said he'd explained everything satisfactorily. She took over the books to honor his memory, she said. And has anyone else examined those books since? Miss Marple asked. No, Lydia said. They were too complicated for anyone without proper training. She's been making regular reports to the vicar, and everything has appeared in order. Inspector Graves was already moving toward the door. I'll need to see those account books immediately. Mrs. Price, can you take me to Mrs. Trench? As they prepared to leave, Miss Marple lingered for a moment by the donation boxes. Something was troubling her, a detail she couldn't quite place. The necklace had been here all along, hidden in plain sight. Helen had put it here, presumably after the theft, with a note of apology. But why had she taken it in the first place? And why had she written that particular phrase? I could not let them ruin another life. Them, not her, not him, them. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. She thought of the conversation she had overheard in the vest, Mrs. Trench and Mrs. Patterson, whispering urgently about protecting the church's reputation. She thought of Mrs. Trench's insistence that Helen would hold her tongue if she knew what was good for her. And she thought of the marks on Helen's wrist, and the tea things laid out as though for an unexpected guest. Jane, Mrs. Price called from the doorway. Are you coming? In just a moment, Miss Marple said. She made her way to the table where Helen had fallen, studying the chalk outline with clinical detachment. The tea tray had been found here, overturned. But tea for how many? She tried to remember what Inspector Graves had said, but he hadn't mentioned the number of cups. Moving to the kitchen, she found Mrs. Bates, the cleaner, industriously scrubbing a counter. Mrs. Bates, I wonder if I might ask you something. When you found Miss Cottrell yesterday morning, the tea things, how many cups were there? The woman paused in her scrubbing. 2, miss. 2 cups and sauces and the pot and a plate of biscuits. I thought it odd at the time, her preparing tea for company so late in the evening. Did you mention this to the police? I told the constable, but I don't know if he wrote it down. He seemed more concerned with how she fell. 2 cups. Helen had been expecting someone she trusted enough to meet after dark in an empty hall, someone for whom she would prepare tea with a careful courtesy of the brought-up young woman she had been, and that someone, Miss Marple was now certain, had pushed her to her death. She thanked Mrs. Bates and made her way out into the cold morning air. The snow had stopped, and weak sunlight filtered through the clouds, making the churchyard sparkle. Inspector Graves and Mrs. Price were already climbing into the police car. Miss Marple followed more slowly, her mind working through the implications of what she had learned. The necklace was found. Helen's note suggested she'd been trying to protect someone, and somewhere in the church accounts, Miss Marple suspected, lay the truth that had cost Helen Cottrell her life. Chapter 8. The letter under the tablecloth. Mrs. Trench's house stood at the far end of the village, a handsome Georgian residence that spoke of old money and established respectability. Inspector Graves rang the bell with the air of a man steeling himself for an unpleasant task. The housekeeper who answered informed them that Mrs. Trench was not at home. She'd gone to London on the morning train unexpectedly and was not expected back until the following day. London, Inspector Graves repeated. When did she leave? Very early, sir. Before 7th gain, she said it was urgent business that couldn't wait. The inspector's expression grew considerably grimmer. I'll need to see the church account books. Mrs. Price, are they kept here or at the vicarage? Mrs. Trench keeps them here in her late husband's study. She said it was more secure than the church office. The housekeeper, impressed by the inspector's authority, and perhaps troubled by her mistress's sudden departure, allowed them into the study. It was a masculine room, lined with legal volumes and ledgers, dominated by a large mahogany desk. The account books, when located, proved to be models of neat bookkeeping. Inspector Graves spent an hour examining them, while Miss Marple and Mrs. Price waited in the drawing room. When he emerged, his face was troubled. Everything appears to be in perfect order. Every penny accounted for, every donation properly recorded. If there's been embezzlement, it's been covered extraordinarily well. Perhaps too well, Miss Marple murmured. The inspector looked at her. What do you mean? I mean that perfection can sometimes be suspicious in itself. Real accounts honestly kept usually contain small errors. A transposed figure here, a minor discrepancy there. These books are flawless. You're suggesting they've been falsified. I'm suggesting they may have been reconstructed after the fact. If Mr. Trench was embezzling funds before his death, his widow would have had months to create a new set of books that concealed his crimes. Mrs. Price looked stricken. But Jane, that would mean Lydia has been lying to us all this time, and the audit next month would have revealed the truth, Miss Marple finished quietly. Unless something prevented the audit from proceeding, something like a dramatic theft that cast doubt on the church's financial management and necessitated a complete investigation. Inspector Graves stared at her. You think she staged the theft deliberately to postpone the audit? I think it's worth considering. A stolen necklace worth several hundred would certainly delay any other financial inquiries while the police investigated. And if the necklace were to be found eventually, perhaps in some innocent location, The matter would be closed with no one examining the actual accounts too closely. But Helen Cottrell discovered the plan, Mrs. Price said slowly. That's what the note meant. She was trying to protect someone, Mrs. Trench perhaps, or her husband's memory. Miss Marple nodded. Helen worked for a solicitor. She would have understood the legal implications of embezzlement, and she was, by all accounts, a kind-hearted girl. When she realized what Mrs. Trench was planning, she may have tried to stop it by taking the necklace herself and hiding it, hoping to resolve the matter quietly. And Mrs. Trench killed her for it, Inspector Graves said grimly. That remains to be proven, Miss Marple said, though I suspect we may find evidence if we look carefully enough. They returned to the church hall, where the inspector conducted a meticulous search. It was Miss Marple who found the final piece of the puzzle, quite literally under the raffle table, where it had been overlooked in the initial confusion. The tablecloth, when lifted, revealed a folded letter that had been tucked beneath it, presumably falling there when the lights went out. The paper was of good quality, slightly yellowed, and the handwriting was masculine and educated. Inspector Graves read it aloud, his voice carefully neutral. My dearest Lydia, I can no longer live with what I've done. The church trusted me, and I betrayed that trust for our benefit. The isms I took were meant to secure our future, but they have secured only my shame. I have tried to repay what I took, but the amount grows faster than I can replace it. When the audit comes, everything will be revealed. I cannot bear the disgrace this will bring upon you. Forgive me. There was a long silence. Mrs. Price had tears running down her cheeks. Bernard wrote this, she whispered. He did steal from the church, and he died before he could make it right. And Lydia has been trying to cover it up ever since, Inspector Graves said. The perfect accounts, the staged theft, the delay of the audit, it all fits. Miss Marple examined the letter carefully. This is dated the 20th of April last year, 3 days before Bernard Trench died. I wonder if Mrs. Trench ever saw it. What difference does that make? The inspector asked. Possibly none, possibly everything. Miss Marple refolded the letter with careful fingers. Inspector, I think you'll find that if you examine the church accounts from before Mr. Trench's death, the originals, not the reconstructed versions Mrs. Trench has been showing the vicar, you'll discover significant discrepancies. The question is where those original books might be. She would have destroyed them, surely. Mrs. Price said, perhaps, or perhaps she kept them, thinking they might be useful as evidence that the embezzlement was entirely her husband's doing. Should she ever be discovered? Miss Marple paused. Inspector, when you searched the study, did you notice a safe behind the portrait of her late husband? The housekeeper said, only Mrs. Trench has the combination. Then I suspect that's where we'll find what we're looking for, Miss Marple said. Inspector Graves looked at her with new respect. You've given this considerable thought, Miss Marple. I've had some experience with human nature, she said mildly, and I found that people who commit crimes for what they consider good reasons, protecting a loved one's reputation, preserving their social position, often cannot bear to completely destroy the evidence. They keep it almost as a form of penance, hidden away where no one will find it. Then we'll need to wait for Mrs. Trench to return from London, the inspector said. Though I suspect when she learns we found both the necklace and her husband's letter, she won't be eager to come back at all. Oh, she'll come back, Miss Marple said with quiet certainty. She has nowhere else to go. And I rather think she'll want to explain herself. People who commit crimes to protect others often harbor a great need to be understood, if not forgiven. The afternoon light was fading as they left the church hall. Miss Marple walked slowly, her mind turning over the accumulated evidence. The pattern was nearly complete now, lacking only the final confirmation that Mrs. Trench herself would provide. But there was still the matter of Helen Cottrell's death, and that Miss Marple reflected would require justice of a different kind entirely. Chapter 9. The Truth Behind the Bazaar. Mrs. Trench returned to Waverley Edge on the evening train, just as Miss Marple had predicted. Word reached Mrs. Price's cottage shortly after 8 that the inspector had requested her presence at the vicarage, and that all committee members should attend as well. "Will you come with me, Jane?" Mrs. Price asked, her voice anxious. "I confess I'm rather dreading this." "Of course," Miss Marple said, setting aside her knitting. "Though I suspect Mrs. Trench knows precisely why she's been summoned." The vicarage drawing room had been arranged with unusual formality. Inspector Graves stood by the fireplace, his expression stern. The vicar sat at his desk, looking deeply troubled. Mrs. Clement hovered near the door, wringing her hands. Mrs. Patterson and Miss Wickham occupied the sofa, their faces reflecting varying degrees of apprehension and curiosity. Mrs. Trench was the last to arrive. She entered with her characteristic poise, though Miss Marple noted the shadows beneath her eyes and a certain brittleness in her composure that had not been there before. She wore black, unreeved by any ornament, and her hands were bare of gloves. "Inspector," she said coolly, "I understand you wish to see me. I hope this won't take long. It's been a tiring day." "Please sit down, Mrs. Trench," Inspector Graves said. It was not a request. She sat arranging her skirts with precise movements. Her eyes swept the room, taking in each face, lingering longest in Miss Marple, who met her gaze with calm steadiness. "I'll come directly to the point," the inspector said. "The missing necklace has been found. It was hidden in the overseas mission donation tin along with a note written by Miss Helen Cottrell." If he expected a reaction, he was disappointed. Mrs. Trench's expression remained impassive. How very strange. Then Helen did take it after all. Poor troubled girl. That's not what the note suggests. Inspector Graves continued. It reads as though she was protecting someone. And we've also discovered something else. He produced the letter, now carefully preserved in an evidence envelope. Your late husband's confession of embezzlement found under the raffle table. This time there was a reaction. Mrs. Trench's face went very pale and her hands clenched in her lap, but her voice remained steady when she spoke. I don't know what you're talking about. I think you do, Miss Marple said quietly. All eyes turned to her. Your husband stole from the church funds over a period of months, perhaps years. He wrote that letter 3 days before his death, consumed by guilt and shame. When he died, suddenly you found it, and you found the evidence of what he'd done in the account books he'd been keeping. Mrs. Trench's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Miss Marple continued, her voice gentle but implacable. You were faced with a terrible choice. You could reveal the truth and destroy your husband's reputation, or you could try to conceal it. Being a woman of considerable capability, you chose the latter. You taught yourself accounting well enough to create a new set of books, perfectly balanced, showing no irregularities. You made regular reports to the vicar, maintained appearances, and gradually began repaying what your husband had stolen. This is speculation, Mrs. Trench said, but her voice lacked conviction. The church accounts show consistent anonymous donations over the past 8 months, Inspector Graves said. Donations that coincidentally match the amounts your husband embezzled. We've examined your bank records, Mrs. Trench. The timing is remarkably consistent. If I was repaying the debt, surely that proves my good intentions, Mrs. Trench said sharply. It proves you were trying to make amends, Miss Marple agreed. But then came word of the audit scheduled for February. An audit that would examine not just the current books, but historical records. An audit that would likely uncover the truth despite your efforts to conceal it. Mrs. Trench remained silent, her face a mask. So you devised a plan, Miss Marple continued. A dramatic theft during the bazaar that would throw the church finances into chaos and delay any audit indefinitely. You arranged for Lady Wickham's necklace to be donated, knowing its value would make the theft significant enough to warrant extensive investigation. You positioned yourself at the raffle table and you created the opportunity for theft by tampering with the fuse box. The vicer said the fuse simply failed. Mrs. Patterson protested. That wiring has always been temperamental. The first time it failed, perhaps, Miss Marple said. But it's remarkable that it should fail again the very night Helen Cottrell died. Inspector, I believe if you examine the fuse box carefully, you'll find evidence of deliberate interference. Inspector Graves nodded. We have. The switch had been partially loosened. A sharp tug would have caused the lights to fail. Helen saw what you did during that first blackout, Miss Marple said, addressing Mrs. Trench directly. She was standing near the table, and she saw you reach for the display case. She saw the red gloves. Your red gloves. And she understood what was happening. Perhaps not immediately, but later when she had time to think. Mrs. Trench's composure was beginning to crack. Her hands trembled slightly in her lap. She worked for a solicitor, Miss Marple continued. She understood financial matters, understood the implications of embezzlement and fraud, and she was a kind-hearted girl who'd been befriended by you. When she realized what you were planning, she couldn't bear to see you ruined, so she took the necklace herself before you could complete your plan, hid it in the donation tin, and wrote that note. I could not let them ruin another life, Mrs. Price quoted softly. She meant Bernard's life had already been ruined by his actions. She didn't want yours to be ruined too. But Helen's intervention meant your plan had failed, Miss Marple said. The necklace would be found. Questions would be asked, and eventually the truth would emerge. So you arranged to meet her at the church hall that evening. You asked her to prepare tea to make it seem like a friendly discussion, and when she arrived, you killed her. No. The word was barely a whisper. The marks on her wrist. Inspector Graves said Dr. Wickham has re-examined the body. They're consistent with someone gripping her forcefully, then pushing her to the ground. You staged it to look like an accident. Knocked over the tea things caused the fuse to fail again to support your story of the hall's dangerous conditions. She was going to tell, Mrs. Trench said suddenly, her voice breaking. Don't you understand? Helen came to me after the bazaar. She said she'd taken the necklace to protect me, but that she couldn't lie to the police. She said she was going to return it and tell them everything about the theft, about Bernard, about all of it. She said it was the right thing to do, that truth was more important than reputation. The room was utterly silent. Even the fire seemed to burn more quietly. She was so naive, Mrs. Trench continued, tears now streaming down her face. She didn't understand what it would mean. Bernard's name dragged through the mud. Our family disgraced. Everything we'd worked for destroyed. I tried to reason with her, but she wouldn't listen. She kept saying she was sorry, but she had to do what was right. So you killed her, Inspector Graves said flatly. I didn't mean to. Mrs. Trench's voice was anguished. Now werged. I grabbed her arm, tried to make her understand. She pulled away, and I pushed her. She fell, struck her head on the table corner. It happened so quickly. One moment she was standing there with that infuriatingly virtuous expression, and the next she was lying on the floor, not moving. And you left her there, Miss Marple said quietly. What else could I do? She was already dead. Calling for help wouldn't have changed that. So I arranged things to look like an accident, threw the fuse again, and left. I hoped it would be ruled an unfortunate tragedy, and that would be the end of it. But you forgot about your husband's letter, Inspector Graves said. The one that had fallen under the tablecloth during the original blackout. Mrs. Trench closed her eyes. I didn't even know it was there. Bernard must have brought it to the bazaar, perhaps meaning to confess to the vicer. When the lights went out, it must have slipped from his pocket or from somewhere he had hidden it. One final piece of evidence condemning you, Miss Marple observed, as such things often do. The vicer, who had been silent throughout, finally spoke. Lydia, why didn't you come to us? We would have understood about Bernard. The church is meant to offer forgiveness, not condemnation. Would you? Mrs. Trench's laugh was bitter. Would you have understood embezzlement? Would the village have forgiven the treasurer's widow? Number I would have been shunned, pied, whispered about forever? I couldn't bear it. I won't bear it. Inspector Graves stepped forward. Lydia Trench, I'm arresting you for the murder of Helen Cottrell. You're not obliged to say anything, but anything you do say may be given in evidence. As he led her away, Mrs. Trench turned back to look at Miss Marple. You knew, didn't you? From the very beginning. I suspected, Miss Marple said gently. But suspicion and proof are very different things. Helen was right, wasn't she? Truth is more important than reputation. Miss Marple met her eyes with compassion. I'm afraid it is. The door closed behind them, and the room erupted in agitated conversation. But Miss Marple sat quietly, thinking of a kind-hearted young woman who had tried to do the right thing and paid for it with her life, and of another woman who'd tried to protect her reputation and lost everything in the attempt. Outside, the church bells began to ring for even song, their sound clear and solemn in the winter night. Chapter 10, Justice Beneath the Bells. Snow fell softly on Waverley Edge 3 days later, transforming the village once more into a scene of deceptive tranquility. Miss Marple sat in Mrs. Price's sitting room, her knitting needles clicking steadily as she worked on the final inches of her great-nephew's scarf. The cat dozed on the hearth rug, oblivious to the drama that had unfolded. Mrs. Price, pouring tea with hands that still trembled slightly, seemed older than she had a week ago. I still can hardly believe it. Lydia, of all people, so composed, so respectable to think she was capable of such deception. Respectability, Miss Marple observed, is often a mask we wear to conceal our true selves. And the more perfect the mask, the more desperately we cling to it when it begins to slip. But murder Jane to kill poor Helen, who was only trying to help her. Mrs. Trench didn't see it as help. She saw it as betrayal. Miss Marple accepted her teacup. Helen's honesty threatened everything Mrs. Trench had worked to preserve. In her mind, she had already sacrificed so much. Her peace of mind, her financial security, months of effort repaying her husband's debts. To have it all exposed by a well-meaning girl must have seemed unbearable. The vicar says he would have helped her if only she'd asked. I'm sure he would have. But pride is a powerful thing, Agatha. Mrs. Trench couldn't bear the thought of being pied, of being whispered about as the wife of a thief. She would rather commit theft herself and ultimately murder than face that humiliation. Mrs. Price was quiet for a moment, stirring her tea. Inspector Graves said you provided all the crucial insights. The pattern of the theft, the significance of the torn raffle ticket, the letter under the tablecloth. How did you see it all so clearly? Miss Marple smiled faintly. I saw what was there to be seen. The pieces were all present. The overly perfect account books, Mrs. Trench's careful positioning at the raffle table, her consultation of her watch before the lights failed, and most tellingly, her lack of surprise when the necklace was discovered missing. She announced the theft before she could have properly examined the display case. I didn't notice that at all. Most people don't. They see what they expect to see. A respectable woman, a charitable committee, a festive bazaar. They don't look beneath the surface to observe the tensions, the inconsistencies, the small details that don't quite fit the picture. Like the red gloves. Precisely. Helen saw someone in red gloves reach toward the case, and everyone assumed she was accusing the wearer of theft. But she never actually said that, did she? She merely reported what she saw. It was Mrs. Trench who immediately became defensive, drawing attention to her own red gloves before anyone else could. Mrs. Price shook her head wonderingly, and the forged raffle ticket stub that the constable found. Mrs. Trench created it to support her story that the theft occurred during the blackout. She needed evidence that someone had tampered with the raffle arrangements, but she made a small error. The number didn't match any ticket legitimately sold. A tiny oversight, but a revealing one. The door knocker sounded, and presently Mrs. Clement was shown in her face drawn, but determined. She declined tea, but accepted a seat by the fire. "I came to thank you, Miss Marple. The inspector told me you were instrumental in uncovering the truth. Without your observations, Mrs. Trench might have gotten away with it." "I doubt that very much," Miss Marple said. "The truth has a way of emerging eventually. I merely hastened the process somewhat." Poor Helen. Mrs. Clement's eyes filled with tears. To die trying to do the right thing. It seems so terribly unfair. "It is unfair," Miss Marple agreed quietly. "But I like to think that Helen knew even at the end that she had acted with integrity. That's a comfort denied to Mrs. Trench, who must live now with a knowledge of what she's done. The vicar wants to hold a memorial service for Helen, something to honor her properly. The whole village will attend, I should think." "That would be most appropriate," Miss Marple said. After Mrs. Clement departed, Miss Marple and Mrs. Price sat in comfortable silence, watching the snow fall past the window. The village beyond was settling into its evening routine, smoke rising from chimneys, lights appearing in windows, the sound of the church bells marking the hour. "What will happen to the church funds?" Mrs. Price asked eventually. "With all that's occurred, Inspector Graves tells me that Mrs. Trench had nearly repaid the full amount her husband stole. The bishop has agreed that, given the circumstances, the matter can be quietly resolved. Bernard Trench's reputation needn't be publicly destroyed, which I think would have pleased Helen. She really was trying to protect them both, wasn't she? Bernard's memory and Lydia's future. She was, and she paid a terrible price for her compassion." Miss Marple's needles paused. "There's Allison in that, I think. Sometimes our attempts to protect others from consequences can lead to even greater tragedies. Do you suppose Mrs. Trench ever cared for Helen at all, or was it all pretense?" Miss Marple considered this carefully. "I think she did care in her way. That's what makes it so particularly tragic. But when forced to choose between affection and self-preservation, she chose herself. Many people do when tested." The cat stirred, stretched, and settled back into sleep. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the tracks and traces of the past week's events beneath a blanket of white. "Will you stay much longer in Waverley Edge?" Mrs. Price asked. "I think I shall return to St. Mary Me in a few days. You've been most hospitable, Agatha, but I'm sure you'll be glad to have your cottage to yourself again." "Nonsense. You're welcome to stay as long as you like." Mrs. Price managed to smile. "Though I confess, life in St. Mary Me must seem quite dull after all this excitement." "On the contrary," Miss Marple said, resuming her knitting, "I find that villages are much the same everywhere, the same hopes and fears, the same small vanities and large mistakes. Human nature doesn't change, whether in Waverley Edge or St. Mary Me or anywhere else." "That's rather a depressing thought, is it?" Miss Marple's eyes held a gentle wisdom. "I find it rather comforting myself. If human nature is constant, then so are human virtues. For every Mrs. Trench who chooses deception, there's a Helen Cottrell who chooses truth. For every act of selfishness, there's an act of kindness. The balance isn't always obvious, but it's there." The church bells rang again, their sound carrying clearly through the snow-muffled air. Miss Marple counted the strokes automatically. 8. In the village, people would be settling in for the evening, perhaps discussing the scandal over their supper tables, perhaps already moving on to other concerns. "It's remarkable," she said softly, more to herself than to Mrs. Price, "how charity can reveal the truest measure of a person, not by what they give, but by what they're willing to take." Mrs. Price looked puzzled. "I'm not sure I follow. Mrs. Trench organized charity bazaars, managed church funds, appeared the very model of Christian service. But when tested, she was willing to take an innocent girl's life to preserve her reputation. The giving was all surface. The taking revealed the truth beneath. And Helen gave everything, including her life, in the service of what she believed was right. That's the rarest charity of all. They sat together as darkness fell completely and the snow continued its silent work of covering and concealing. Somewhere in the village, a family was mourning their daughter. Somewhere else, a woman sat in a cell, confronting the ruins of her carefully constructed life. But here in this warm sitting room, two elderly women drank their tea and spoke of ordinary things, while outside the church bells marked the passing hours and the steady, inexorable march of justice. The scarf was nearly finished now, Miss Marple noted with satisfaction. Just a few more rows and she could bind it off. Her great-nephew would wear it, never knowing that it had been completed while its maker solved a murder and saw that truth prevailed, which was exactly as it should be, she reflected. The world went on, stitches were completed, mysteries were solved, and justice, however delayed, was eventually served. The snow fell softly, marking the end of both the bazaar and the deceit it had concealed.